Good morning. I'm Jackie Rogers with the Division of Program Standards. I work with professional learning and particularly with the standards rollout. So excited you could join us today. This is our May 9th webcast, and we're going to be talking about the standards for mathematical practices. If you were with us last week, you met Maggie Doyle, who is a math consultant here at KDE, and she is going to be taking you through some of the information about the SMP. So, Maggie, I'm going to let you get started and thank everyone for being here today. Remember, too, that you can use Go Soapbox for questions. So you just go to gosoapbox.com, which you can see at the bottom of the screen, the information for how to access that. Okay, Maggie?
Thank you, Jackie. So, happy Teacher Appreciation Week to all of you out there. And I know if you're like me, that you probably can't think of a better way to spend part of your Teacher Appreciation Week than talking about the standards for mathematical practice. So, let's go ahead and start looking at what we want to see today. So, today we have 4 things that we want to talk about. We want to leave this webcast with you knowing what are the standards for mathematical practice, why are they so important, where are they, where can you find them and find information about them, and then how educators can get additional support moving forward with implementing and engaging students with those in the classroom. So to start, there's a distinction within the mathematical standards about mathematical content standards and mathematical practice standards. The content standards address a balance of conceptual understanding skills, procedural skills and fluency, and application. The practices are how students engage with that content. And so this is a little bit different from the interdisciplinary literacy practices that Mickey is going to talk about to you. Mickey Ray, our literacy consultant, is going to talk to you about that in a future webcast. But in mathematics, the standards for mathematical practice are additional standards. And they really need to be a part of our instruction because they're how students should experience that mathematical content. There are 8 standards for mathematical practice, and they are listed on the screen for you. And those are the same K through 8. So there is not any difference in those student experiences in terms of those expectations at any grade level, but how that student might engage with that practice is going to be different at each grade level. So that is what our practices are. There's more information on each one of these individual practices in the front matter of the Kentucky Academic Standards for Mathematics. And it's important to note that while those are things that we see wanting to happen in classrooms around Kentucky, these practices don't happen organically. They have to be intentionally planned for in order to make sure that our students have a really well-rounded mathematical experience in the classroom. So why are they so important? So I like to think of it as the way that students are going to experience that content. And from my perspective, thinking back on it as a teacher, I want students to know how to get from point A to point B. But if I only show them one route to do that, and I consistently take them along the same path from point A to point B, then what happens to that student if they're trying to travel that path, but they can't use it anymore? They get stuck in construction, or for some reason they can't take that route that they're used to. Unless we intentionally plan for students to have multiple experiences in how to get from point A to point B, then they're going to be stuck. And that's not what we want for our students. We want our students to have a well-rounded experience in the classroom so that not only are they getting from point A to point B, but at the same time they're building this larger conceptual schema or map of all the destinations along the way, and they're seeing this bigger picture, which is what we really want for our students when they apply mathematics, is seeing a bigger picture and how different routes can get them to that destination. So I wanted to take a moment and just show you where within our standards document the standards for mathematical practice are. So as a part of the teacher writing team in that standards revision process, I can tell you that the writers really felt like teachers needed a lot of support with engaging students in the standards of mathematical practice. So they're going to take up a lot of real estate on the standards page. Within each cluster, they are headlined at the top with a list of those 8 mathematical practices. They're going to show up a lot more. So in the middle of each cluster, the content standards are on the left side of the page and the clarifications are on the right. You'll notice in that section with content standards, there are specific mathematical practices tagged to each of those content standards. Now I want to myth bust here just for a second. That does not mean that those are the only way that students can engage with that content. But the writing team really felt like we had such an opportunity for teacher growth through these standards rollout that they wanted to just provide guidance on standards of mathematical practice that might lend themselves really nicely to mesh with that particular content. So that doesn't mean that those are the only practices that one could engage in to teach that content, but it's just intended to guide that thinking and that reflection on the teacher's part. Also, that does not mean that if you cover that content standard, you have addressed and engaged with that practice. So that practice and engaging with that has to be intentionally designed in the lesson. It doesn't mean that one comes right along with the other without that intentional planning on the part of the teacher. And then you're also going to notice along the bottom of each cluster is a section called Attending to the Standards for Mathematical Practice. And that was really put in by the teacher writing team to show what that should look like in a classroom. What should the students be experiencing, and what is that going to look like if you're performing an evaluation or you're doing a walkthrough? If you walk into that classroom, this is something that you might see students doing if they're learning the content in this cluster. And so that's there to help guide teachers who may want some ideas on how they could integrate the practices into their instruction, but also as a support for those people who contribute to our growth as professionals but may not have that content background. That is going to really provide them with an opportunity to really see what engaging with those practices and that content should look like. So you might also be thinking, how can we get support with this? Because we know, and it's probably your experience as well, that as a state, we have a varied amount of experience and training with the standards for mathematical practice. So once we adopted the Kentucky Academic Standards for Mathematics, we designed a module called Getting to Know the Kentucky Academic Standards for Mathematics. That module was the subject of last week's webcast. So the section C is in there to take a closer look at the standards for mathematical practice, because we understand that we really need a shared understanding across the state at how we can engage our students with these practices. There are some pockets that are doing this really well already, but there are some places where they may not have had any training at all. So we really wanted a shared and consistent learning experience around these standards for mathematical practice, or SMPs. So the module is designed to build that shared understanding. So within that section, the essential idea is that we understand that we have a great opportunity for growth and that we have to meet the needs and the professional learning support needed for all of our teachers. And that's experienced teachers, brand new teachers, teachers with alternative certifications. And so we really want everyone to go through and start rolling out these standards with a deep understanding of what those practices will look like. So the first thing in this section of the module is not intended to be a gotcha or anything like that, but I encourage the facilitator to ask the participants to list, just on scrap paper or on a Post-it note, I encourage them to list the 8 mathematical practices. They're not going to turn it in. It's not going to be a grade. It's not for anyone else's eyes. But that's going to give the facilitator an idea of how comfortable their participants are with these practices to start with. Again, not intended to be a gotcha, but I have to think of it as sometimes you don't realize that you need to make a change until you step on the scale, or you do your first KDE webcast last week and then for some reason watch it later. But sometimes you need that moment of, oh my gosh, there are more things for me to learn. There are more ways that I can grow. And that's what this module is all about, providing opportunities for growth and moving forward for educators at every level. So in the module, we encourage discussion around each of these mathematical practices. And that's the power of the PLC setting for these. So we encourage the facilitator to give the participants their voice in this discussion. So this is their time to share. It's their time to learn from one another and with one another. So we have highlights on each mathematical practice, similar to this one, which you're looking at on the screen, which is Math Practice 1. We list possible teacher actions, possible student actions, so that as they're working in their small group, teachers can have some discussions. When have they seen this work really well? What have they noticed about their students when they're designing their lessons with these things in mind? And that's going to be that power. That's where your department or your PLC starts to really grow together and have these conversations that are going to really improve math instruction holistically across your PLC or your department. There's a basic task in this section that if you are a facilitator and you do that first activity and you have participants who are really struggling as you look around with coming up with what those mathematical practices are, this is probably where you want to start with them. If you have a department who's had a lot of training and they seem to roll off those 8 practices with ease and they know what they're talking about, then this might be something that you could move a little more quickly through or just kind of scale back in terms of time. But we understand that part of that shared understanding is meeting teachers where they are. And so let's say your department or your district did a lot of training with the SMPs 3 years ago. Well, what's the makeup of your PLC? Is that the same? Did everybody get to go to that professional learning? Or if you only sent 1 or 2, do they have a platform to share that? So really evaluate honestly where your teachers are. And then we have a lot of teachers who are going to need to start here. So if you notice, this is a kindergarten sample task, but there are those tasks available for every grade level and by conceptual category in high school. But if you look at the page, this is the architecture of the standards. This is just one cluster. But if you'll notice, it looks very similar to what we looked at earlier when I was pointing out where the SMPs are. But if you look down there at the bottom at that attending to the SMPs section, you'll notice that the math practices labeled with each one of those descriptions have been taken out. Because if you are having your first experience as a teacher with the standards for mathematical practice, part of that learning is, well, what does it mean if students are modeling with mathematics? What does it look like if they're attending to precision? So we want them to read that description of what students are actually doing and what that would look like in the classroom and make sure that they can identify what practice students are really engaging in if they're noticing those behaviors in the classroom. So that's kind of the basic, let's start here and then build our learning until we're ready for something next. And that next something is the next discovery task within that section of the module. So again, if you want more professional learning on the SMPs, this is another great activity. So again, a simple kindergarten task, but they are by grade level. There are 8 tasks. There are 8 mathematical practices. So participants are encouraged to read through the tasks. They're going to need some time to do that. And then they're going to think about which practice that task was intended to engage a student with. Now, it's going to be really important that this occurs in a PLC or in a safe learning environment, mainly because the benefit of this activity is the discussion. That's where you're going to see growth in your PLC. That's where you're going to see growth in your departments. And that's where you're going to see growth in your teachers as professionals and in that learning and in the instruction that they design. So it's important to note right here that there is no 100% for sure answer key. So some of these tasks will engage more than one practice. And in a lot of them, what we hope that teachers will realize, and this is why part of that power is in the discussion, is that depending on how you facilitate that task and the questions that you ask of students, that's going to determine which practice that task aligns to. But we want those discussions happening because one teacher in your PLC may say, well, I thought it was this because I would ask students questions A, B, C. But another teacher might see that task completely differently, but in another completely valuable and valid way. And so we want teachers to start really thinking about their instruction in that way and thinking about how they could maybe intentionally review their assignments and their lessons to make sure that students are getting those opportunities to engage with a variety of practices. So the next thing in that participant guide are notes for the facilitator. So as we present about the modules, we understand that sometimes those facilitators of that professional learning might not be content experts. So this is not intended to be a scoring guide for a summative assessment. This is intended to spark discussion and make sure that your teachers are thinking along the lines that the author was when they crafted these. But again, be flexible. Consider how you could implement that task in a different way or ask different questions and engage with a different task. So again, the value of this is not, oh, you got it right or you got it wrong, but how do you see this task? What are the questions you would ask? And that's where your participants are really going to grow. Also in the module, and this is an additional place that you can get some support, there is a document that provides student actions, teacher actions, and also really importantly, questions that will promote each individual SMP. So this one that it's listed for SMP1, you can see what students might be doing, what teachers might be doing, and then what questions, if I'm a teacher and I'm thinking, you know what, I really want to hit this with my students. Well, then there's some question stems that you might want to consider integrating into your lesson plan to make sure that you get an intentional drive and that you're making sure that your students now understand that part of the map. They can get from point A to point B on that route in addition to another that they might have seen before, so that essentially you have all of these concepts that are interconnecting and really opening up that whole world of concepts and thought and schema for students. Another place that you'll be able to get professional learning on the standards for mathematical practice is the June Learning Lab. So Jackie Rogers is going to come back and she's going to talk to you about how you can register with that in just a moment. But there's going to be a session specifically on the standards for mathematical practice at each of those. And the idea there is that we want teachers to know where the standards for mathematical practice are, where they can be found in the document. We want them to know the supports that are already there for them. And then once we've talked about that, we're going to have some breakout sessions within that one session so that elementary teachers get to work with an elementary expert. Middle school, same thing. High school, same thing. And then we're going to come back together. And again, I've said this a lot, but we want that discussion part to really be that powerful tool. So we're going to talk about it, we're going to break out and look at our specific content specialties, and then we're going to come back and have that greater discussion about those standards for mathematical practice. So supports right now, you've got the module, you've got the learning lab, and then I'll just remind you about the survey at the end of the module, because if you feel like you need more support around the mathematical practices, please let us know that in that feedback survey. And also, you can pick specific practices. So you may feel really comfortable with 1 or 2, but you may recognize that your students need to experience all 8, and there are some that you're really having trouble directing them to. So you can let us know that in the feedback survey as well. So I'm going to invite Jackie back up and talk more about the professional learning.
Thank you, Maggie. You did such a nice job with that. And we are excited about our learning lab that's coming up. So this is going to be a professional learning conference the second week of June. It starts on June the 10th, and we have several different locations: Christian County, Louisville, and Jefferson County. That location is to be determined at this time, but we're going to get that out soon. But if you're in that location, please join us there, and you can register for that one. Also on the 12th in Carter County and the 14th of June in Lexington. So we have a lot of people that have registered so far. If for some reason you need to change your registration, if you need to cancel one and maybe you're moving to the Louisville location, you can do that. Just make sure that you do cancel one so that that space is open for others. But the 5 things to know before you go, including that, is remembering again to choose the right kind of professional learning facilitators for your work that you're doing in your schools. That's going to be a really crucial piece. And Maggie's speaking today, but also Mickey Ray will be with us next week, are talking about issues that are going to be very important for the facilitators of the learning to do. So that's going to be very important to think about. We've talked about our June conference a bit. If you need more information about registration, you can find that at kystandards.org. If you have questions about today's webcast, and we didn't have any questions on Go Soapbox, but if you do have questions about this in general, you can also send questions to KDE standards at education.ky.gov. We also want you to remember that you can contact your educational cooperative that's in your region or even outside of your region for support. They are very interested and invested in this standards work as well. Next week's webcast is the Architecture of Newly Revised Social Studies Standards. And so it's the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies. It's going to be a part of our conversation. That's going to be a very important and I think lively, interesting conversation about social studies. I want to also point out, just going back to the June conference, the main focus in that conference is going to be those newly revised standards in reading, writing, and mathematics. But social studies is also going to be a part of that day. So please join us for that. Some have asked me, who does the conference really cater to? We have the bulk of the seats really for teachers. This is a lot about good instruction, and it's about approaching those standards in your classroom, doing the very best for children. And there's also a strand for administrators. Definitely you'd want principals, instructional supervisors, coaches, perhaps other leadership in the school or the district to be a part of that as well. And we also have a strand for higher education. So we're looking forward to those days, and we thank you for being a part of our webcast today. So thank you for joining us, and join us again next week.
Thank you.